Hi and welcome to another gaming video, and in today's video I want to talk about the Dreamcast versus the PlayStation 2. So these are both 6th gen consoles, and maybe just wind that back a little bit. So a friend of mine was selling a Sega Saturn very cheap, presumably because he was looking to get a PlayStation 1 instead. But as a huge Sega fan, Master System, Mega Drive, the Saturn was on my radar and was the next sort of console to go, so I bought it. I loved it. So the Dreamcast was the next natural progression for me, and what an amazing console it is. Later on I have come to appreciate that the PS2 was great and all that, but is it better? I mean, better is a very subjective, opinion based word. Let's just take a look at both consoles. So I always thought that the Dreamcast was more powerful than the PS2, but technically it isn't. Graphically, the Dreamcast looks stunning. I always found that the PS2 just looked a bit duller, graphic-wise anyway. It looks duller, more washed out, less textured, blocky, and playing something like Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast looks absolutely gorgeous. It's hard to believe that is a 20+ year old game. There's definite graphical differences between the Dreamcast and the PS2. So the PowerVR 2 GPU in the Dreamcast is an absolute beast, but the CPU is lower than the PS2's. The Dreamcast has a 200 MHz Hitachi SH4 processor, whereas the PlayStation 2 has a 294 MHz Emotion Engine processor, which they did bump that up to 299 in the slim models. The Dreamcast has half the system RAM of the PlayStation. It's only got 16 meg versus the 32 meg in the PS2, but the Dreamcast does have twice as much video RAM, which probably explains the much better graphics. It's got 8 meg RAM versus the 4 meg RAM in the PlayStation 2. Now, ironically, both of these consoles are in the same generation, so they're both 6th gen consoles. One is one of the worst selling consoles of all time, and the other is the biggest selling console of all time. You can probably guess which way that's going to go. The Dreamcast sold about 9.1 million consoles, which is even lower than the Wii U at 13 million, versus the PlayStation 2, which is still the biggest selling console of all time at over 150 million. That is a huge difference. So like I said, on pure spec, the PS2 is far more powerful, but graphically the Dreamcast looks miles better. So poor history with the Saturn, the massive success of the PlayStation 1, the sequel Lumen, it really didn't bode well for the Dreamcast or Sega at all. Game collection was quite impressive on the Dreamcast, especially for its short lifespan. The Japanese launch only came with one game, so that was a bit poor, but the US launch, which was about 12 months or so later, did come with 18 games at launch, so that's pretty decent. However, a dispute between Sega and EA over license costs and exclusivity meant that EA pulled out. There's no EA games on Dreamcast. I mean, they were on previous consoles, Master System, Mega Drive, Saturn. They all had copies of FIFA, but there's no FIFA for the Dreamcast, no EA titles at all, and I think that did hurt the console. I mean, there were some alternatives. Sega had some very good alternatives to FIFA, but everyone wants FIFA, and if you've got no EA games, that is a big downside. Poor hardware sales and a lack of game collection. I mean, the games we got were decent, but there were only 600 games released for the Dreamcast versus 10,000 games for the PS2. So it really did hurt. So it's kind of catch-22. Poor hardware sales impacts on game developers. Lack of games will then impact on hardware sales. So that was a big problem for the Dreamcast. So we've looked at hardware and we've looked at the history with the Saturn. So let's look at the games for both systems. So if we take a look at the top 5 selling games, so the top 5 selling games for the PlayStation 2 is GTA San Andreas, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, Gran Turismo 4, GTA Vice City, and Final Fantasy X. Good selection of games there. If we take a look at the top 5 selling games for the Dreamcast, you've got Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, NFL 2K, Shenmue, and Resident Evil Code Veronica. All good games, but they are different worlds when you compare them to the PlayStation. If we take a look at my favourite games for both systems, on the PlayStation 2 you've got Need for Speed Most Wanted, GTA San Andreas, Burnout 3, Black and Killzone. And then if you take a look at my favourite games from the Dreamcast, you've got Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, Shenmue, Quake 3 Arena and Soul Calibur. All fantastic games for both systems, but you can just see that they're different. The styling of gaming is different. I think it's because Sega was still trying to pull away from that 2D arcade style that they brought with them from the Master System and the Mega Drive and even the Saturn, whereas Sony went straight in with, we're going to produce this new modern 3D console with the PS1 and the PS2. Sega struggled to pull away from their roots. I mean, you've got fantastic 3D games like Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur, superb. Shenmue, at the time, it was the biggest costing game, and it never recouped, but the effort was there and it produced an amazing game. So while this is a comparison video of the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2, there were a few titles that was released on both. So you've got Crazy Taxi, Dead or Alive 2, Echo, Defender of the Future, and Resident Evil Code Veronica, all of which look and play considerably better on the Dreamcast. Perhaps I'm Sega biased. Perhaps I have a little grudge against Sony for sort of pushing Sega out of the market, or perhaps the Dreamcast is the better console. But like I said, better is a very subjective, opinionated word. I own both. I even have some games for both systems, and hands down I prefer playing on the Dreamcast. Both the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2 are excellent consoles. I'm not going to sit here and praise the Dreamcast and push the PS2 aside, because it's the PS2 is the biggest selling console. But I do prefer the Dreamcast for certain games. Obviously there are some games that I like to play aren't available on the Dreamcast, so I've got to play them on the PS2. If there's a game on both, I would much prefer to play it on the Dreamcast, and the game selection that you get on the Dreamcast that you don't get on the PlayStation 2 is absolutely phenomenal. So both of these consoles are now 20 plus years old. They still hold their own, they're still fantastic, at least in terms of gameplay, not particularly graphics, although the Dreamcast graphics is still superb. Now, one of the games that I have on both is Echo Defender of the Future, and I've played it on both systems. I love it on both systems, but like I said, I'm maybe a little biased, or perhaps because I was brought up in the Sega era before Sony got their hands into gaming. So I'm going to load this game up on both systems, and I'm going to get my son. Now, he's a big gamer, he's a modern gamer, but obviously living with me, he has an appreciation for older gaming and retro gaming. So I'm going to load up Echo Defender of the Future, and I'm going to get his opinion on it. This is the PlayStation 2 version. I have passed over the reins to my son because he's impartial. You've never played Echo before, have you? No, right. I have, and I'm a bit of a Sega fan anyway. So this is the PlayStation 2 version. I'd like you to pay particular attention to graphics, textures, water. And for anyone that doesn't know, it's a swimming game, basically. I think you can even jump out of the water. I mean, there are missions to do, but I generally just go on a bit of a exploration. But this is the PS2 version. So now we've got the Dreamcast version, and I think loading times is about the same, maybe a little bit quicker. But I want to pay particular attention to the graphics and the textures and the gameplay itself. Now, like I said, I'm not playing this, my son is. So, what's your opinion? I think the textures look smoother. I don't think the Dolphin looks quite as blocky as it does on the PS2.
No, it's a bit better graphic-wise, I think.
Colour's a bit brighter. But I'm assuming the gameplay is just about the same.
Yeah, although you can't use the D-pad to go up and down and left and right.
What, you have to use the little stick?
Yeah.
So these are both 6th gen consoles, PS2 and the Dreamcast. Now, me looking at this, personally, I think the Dreamcast looks way more impressive. I think the game actually runs a little quicker and smoother. But what's your opinion?
Yeah. I agree.
So there you go. There you have a comparison of the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2. A quick sort of run through of the games and a bit of history of the Dreamcast, and then some gameplay from Echo Defender of the Future. Hope you enjoyed that. Link, like, subscribe, enjoy.